Dr. Carl Andrews, the class of 1940 here at Bates, established the Bertha Maybelle Andrews Memorial Lecture to honor his mother, who created the physical education program for women at Bates College. Her extensive professional career included teaching and administrative posts at several schools and colleges in addition to Bates, and a period of service as a Quaker missionary in Argentina. A learned and well-traveled woman, Mrs. Andrews' sense of independence, her commitment to women, and her passion for connecting the moral and intellectual life capture much of what we like to believe distinguishes the particular spirit of this institution. These annual lectures are intended especially to emphasize Mrs. Andrews' conviction that if what we learn does not significantly impact how we live, and that for the common good, then we have failed our mission. Mrs. Andrews summarized her legacy and her mandate this way: we can take nothing with us, but we can leave behind us intelligent citizens who will make the world a better place to live. It's a particular pleasure and privilege for us to have Mrs. Andrews' son here with us this evening, Dr. Carl Andrews, who has come all the way from Florida to attend this lecture, which his generosity makes possible. And we also have Mrs. Andrews' grandson, Bert Andrews. So thank you to the Andrews family for this opportunity. Our distinguished guest lecturer this year, Sister Helen Prejean, has spent her life trying, in Mrs. Andrews' words, to make the world a better place to live. To live. Helen Prejean joined the Sisters of St. Joseph of Medaille in 1957. She received a Bachelor of Arts in English and Education from St. Mary's Dominican College and a Master of Arts in Religious Education from St. Paul's University in Ottawa. Her ministries have included teaching in junior and senior high schools, directing a parish religious education program in New Orleans, and serving as formation director for her religious community. Involvement with poor urban residents in the St. Thomas Housing Project in New Orleans in 1981 led her to prison ministry, where she has been counseling death row inmates in the Louisiana State Penitentiary. To date, she has accompanied 5 of her friends to their executions and has witnessed their deaths. Convinced that the public needed to know what happened in the execution chamber, usually under the cover of late-night darkness, Sister Prejean has devoted herself tirelessly to an educational campaign about the death penalty through her lectures, her organizing work, and her writing, all the while continuing her ministry with death row inmates as well as with victims' families and prison guards. She has helped to found Survive, a victims' advocacy group in New Orleans, and she's recently launched the Moratorium 2000 campaign, a signature petition drive aimed at the worldwide abolition of the death penalty by the start of the new millennium. You'll find literature about that campaign and an opportunity, if you so wish, to sign onto that petition out in the foyer of the chapel as you exit tonight. Of course, Sister Prejean is best known to most of us as the author of the award-winning book Dead Man Walking, an eyewitness account of the death penalty in the United States, which inspired the 1996 film starring Susan Sarandon and Sean Penn. The film was nominated for 4 Academy Awards, and Ms. Sarandon won the Oscar that year for Best Actress in her role portraying Sister Prejean. Sister Helen's present writing project, under contract with Random House, is a spiritual autobiography chronicling her involvement in a variety of social justice issues, including women's struggle for equality in the Roman Catholic Church. In 1998, Sister Prejean was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize. She holds a host of honorary degrees from colleges and universities both in the U.S. and abroad, and has been the recipient of many other honors, including a 1995 Guggenheim Fellowship, the Abolitionist Award from the Louisiana Capital Defense Project, and the Sanctity of Life Award from the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. In 1994, she was the first non-lawyer to receive the Champion of Liberty Award from the National Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers. Sister Prejean's visit to Bates comes at a time when public attention in this country has turned once again to the death penalty debate, and keenly. In January, Missouri death row inmate Darrell Meese's sentence was commuted from death to life in prison due to the last-minute intervention of the Pope. In February, the highly publicized and highly charged case of John William King, a white supremacist on trial for the dragging death of James Byrd Jr., an African American, ended in a sentence of death, a penalty usually unheard of for a white person convicted of murdering a person of color in this country. Also in February, Anthony Porter became the 10th person on Illinois' death row to be released after being proven innocent. It was a group of undergraduates in a journalism class at Northwestern who researched his case and won his freedom. Those of you who are undergraduates in the audience, remember that. Closer to home here in New England, our neighbors to the south in Massachusetts are this very week holding legislative hearings to reinstate the death penalty in the Commonwealth. But it is a less well-known case of the last 2 months that stands out for Helen Prejean. On January 8th, her friend Dobie Williams was executed by lethal injection in the Louisiana State Prison at Angola after 14 years on death row, with 12 separate death dates and stays of execution. Recalling Jesus' words, "Whatever you do to the least of my brothers or sisters, that you do to me," she writes this of her final day with Dobie. "Before we separated, my last words to him were, 'Thank you, Dobie, for the great gift of being your friend.' I got his shy smile. 'Thank you, Sister Helen,' words he had said to me so many times. He was always grateful for love when he met it. It is a privilege to be with the Dobie Williamses of this world, the least of these, and to find such treasure and such grace there. Having vowed her life to following Jesus, who was himself executed by the state in his own day, Helen Prejean has given new meaning to his words, "What you hear in the dark, you must speak in the light." We are privileged and honored to stand in that light with you tonight, Helen, and to hear you speak. Please join me in welcoming Sister Helen Prejean.
Thank you. I'm a Southern storyteller. I want to take you with me to some places tonight. I know the death penalty is not one of the issues that perhaps we have much occasion to think about very much. It's not one of the moral issues that impacts us personally a lot. I didn't dream I was going to be so impacted by it, by getting involved with people on death row and victims' families. And so I want to tell you stories and invite you to reflect deeper. Copies of my book are available. I want to encourage you to get it. I'll be happy to sign the books for you, and you don't have to worry about the time. I'm going to get on that plane early in the morning, and I can sleep on the plane. I'm getting good at that. First, I want to tell you the story just of how the film got to be, because it's a miracle that the film Dead Man Walking came to be. You know, our sisters told me when the book came out, "Helen, don't let Hollywood touch your book." Because I don't know if you noticed, but nuns notice. We don't fare too well in those Hollywood films. I mean, you got all kind of things about nuns. You got the flying nun, and there was Sister Act, which was a lot of fun. Or you have Heaven Knows Miss Allison of a nun with a Marine on a desert island. I mean, what they gonna do, huh? They saying we like Adam and Eve. What are they gonna do, right? And so they didn't have to tell me that, because I know what Hollywood can do to you. And so I was wary. But one October afternoon, I was in the kitchen, the phone rang, I picked up the phone, and there was this voice on the other end says, "Hi, I'm Susan Sarandon. I'm filming the client in Memphis. I'm reading Dead Man Walking." Her words, always looking for substantive characters to portray. If you know her other movies, Bull Durham, White Palace, you know she'd never been a nun in anything else she ever did. She laughs about that too. And here she is on the phone and saying she'd like to meet me, and I said, sure, you know. And so we set a place to go eat when she came to New Orleans. And in Louisiana, you always take care of the food first. So there's this good restaurant, the Bon Ton, where you can get good crawfish étouffée. So we get all that settled. Then I'll rush out, rent Thelma and Louise so I can see what she looks like when she comes, you know, into the restaurant. And of course, in the first scene, I get her mixed up with Gina Davis in it. The whole movie, I'm looking at Gina Davis. I think that's Susan Sarandon. And you know Gina Davis and Thelma and Louise, she's that ditzy one. She keeps doing more and more stupid things. And I kept saying, I like Louise, I like Louise. So when Susan came into the restaurant, I said, thank you, God, she's Louise. I was so relieved, more than anything else. And then I met Susan Sarandon. You can't be with Susan Sarandon 10 minutes and you see the reality of who she is. She talked about the vocation of acting as enforced compassion. She said you enter into the skin and the life of all different kinds of people without judgment, and you portray them. And then I find out that she and Tim Robbins, when they presented the Academy Awards in '94, the year right before she had met me, they called attention to the HIV-positive Haitians that were being illegally confined in Guantanamo. 2 weeks after that, a judge signed papers to release the Haitians. 1 billion people were watching the Academy Awards that night, and they knew they were risking their Hollywood careers. The Academy was furious at them for doing that. They banned them from the Academy Awards the next year. And I thought, hearing her say that, well, she's willing to risk that. Of course, everybody who's in the acting field would love to get an Academy Award, but they were willing to risk that for HIV-positive Haitian people, and most people didn't care a hoot about. And I like that in her. And so the more I talked to her, and the one piece of advice I had been given about the film was, don't sign that contract for anybody to take an option out on your book unless you know you can trust them. Because once you sign that contract, they can do a musical comedy with your book if they want to. And it was tricky stuff to deal with. A nun visiting a death row inmate, okay? Imagine what they can do with that script if they fiddle with it a little bit, right? And so Susan says to me, I'm going to take the book to Tim Robbins, because I think Tim would be great to do the screenplay and to direct this film. We need to do this film. And so 6 months went by, and you know, I would talk to her on the phone, and she would say, can't get Tim to read the book. He's doing all these other projects. And finally, though, she prevailed upon him. And the film exists today because she did. I call her the midwife of Dead Man Walking, because she prevailed on Tim till finally read the book. Then I went up to New York, met with them in their living room, and we sat around and talked about giving shape to a film that could take the American public into a journey of beginning to reflect on the death penalty. And Tim Robbins was real clear that he said, you know, it's easy to do a film about something in the past. Anybody now can do a film about slavery. The dust is all settled on that. We all understand what the issues are. But to do a film about a current controversial issue, it's very difficult. And he said, you know, one of the things we need to probe in this film, without preaching at people, but we need to probe what people's image of God is. Because a lot of the images of God behind the death penalty are that God is indeed a vengeful God who wants the pound of flesh, who wants pain for pain and life for life, and that vengeance is okay with God. And he said we need to probe that. So we began, and he was very collaborative. I have a stack this high of the screenplays of Dead Man Walking where we worked together on it. And I helped him get straight about the nuns. He was taught by nuns who left their own special mark on him. And I said, Tim, you know, your little psyche couldn't stand it if every nun in this country was mad at you. We got to get the nuns straight in this film. So we work real closely. Well, just really on religion and faith and the death penalty, you know, because some people, you know, could say, hey, the death penalty, that helps people get saved, you know. You put them in the crucible of the death penalty, they get straight with God, then they get executed. Death penalty is a good thing. Helps save people, helps save their souls. Anyway, there's all kind of stuff in terms of the religious issues around the death penalty, too. And so here we embark on this. I naively thought, if you got Susan Sarandon, and then they asked Sean Penn to be to play the part of the death row inmate, and he agreed to do that. So I thought, Susan Sarandon, Sean Penn, Tim Robbins is the director. Every Hollywood studio is going to go for this. Wrong. It doesn't fit the formula at all. And they would get to these studios and they would read it and they'd call him up and they'd say, Tim, it'll never go in the box office. I mean, you got no romantic element in it. You know, there are three big things in the formula: sex, violence, and plenty action. And so here's a film where you got a nun. They said, you won't let us fiddle with the script. So that takes care of the romantic part. And then this guy's done a terrible crime and they're going to execute him in the end. It's like it's a downer. Tim, it's a downer. And Tim's saying there's redemption in it. Nah, they didn't go for it. None of them. All the Hollywood studios in the United States turned down the script of Dead Man Walking. Polygram Film International, that had only done one successful film, 4 Weddings and a Funeral, picked it up. And today they're real glad they picked it up. People stood in long lines in the snow to go see Dead Man Walking. The universal reaction in the theater was that when it was over, people sat in silence while all the credits played and Bruce Springsteen's song Dead Man Walking came on, and then in silence they got up and filed out of the theater thinking. And the film is not a polemic. It doesn't give you the 1,492 reasons to be against the death penalty. But what it does is it takes you there, and it takes you to both sides, and it begins reflection. And so the film was born. And so Susan did get the Academy Award for it, and I teased her. It was a hard role for her because she didn't have her usual makeup on and her nice little hairdo and all that. And I said, look, Susan, you were stripped down to your spiritual essence, and that's when you got the Academy Award, because she had been nominated 4 other times. I'm a Catholic, and that night was March the 25th, and that's the Feast of the Annunciation. And 1.3 billion people heard about Dead Man Walking that night. And then the film's all over the world. It was shown in Russia, on Russian television 3 weeks ago. I went to Japan, the taxi cab driver was going, Dead Man Walking? He knew about, and to me it's the impetus of the gospel, and it's made its way around the world. Now I want to take you with me through some of the core experiences that led to the writing of the book, that led to the film. The first is that it took me a while to understand the connection of the gospel of Jesus and the poor and social justice. I was always charitable to people. I was always kind, especially one-on-one to people, but I didn't get it about social justice. And on one level, social justice was so overwhelming to me. How in the world do you put your hand on a rope? There are so many problems. We got problems with racism, we got problems with housing, we got problems with education, we got problems with poverty, we got problems with jobs. I didn't know how to pick it up, so I tended to avoid it. And I said, well, I'll pray for poor people. And that was my way of dealing with it. And when Thanksgiving came around, I'd put my little canned goods in the baskets that they would bring, you know, with the turkeys to give to people. But I didn't get it. And I didn't get the connection really with the gospel of Jesus. And then that changed for me. And in Dead Man Walking, I write the book in first person, present tense, and I just take you with me on the journey I go on. And the first part of that journey is explaining, sharing, how when the enlightenment came, when the understanding came, that really to follow Jesus in the world meant that I needed to be on the side of those who were poor and struggling, the thrown away people, the people that most people just regard as disposable human waste. And that was a turning point in my life. And when I understood that, then I began to understand that justice was important, that you couldn't just be kind to people, but that when there were systems that were wrong, when there were injustices that were part of systems, you had to work to try to change it. And that was an awakening. And that led me to move into the St. Thomas housing development, New Orleans, a black inner city housing development. And you know what? When you wake up to this, and you go there, when you go to your first soup kitchen in the inner city, or you go to a homeless place, or you go to a place where people are suffering with AIDS, you find out there are already people there ahead of you. We hardly ever the first pioneers to break into this. We always go standing on other people's shoulders. And when I moved to St. Thomas, it was in 1981. And the sisters had been living there since 1969. So by the time I walked through the neighborhood, all the kids called me sister. They knew who we were, and there had already been trust built with the people by the time I got there. And I worked at an adult learning center where people came who had dropped out of high school. We have a serious problem with the public schools in Louisiana. 48% of our adults in Louisiana are functionally illiterate. We have huge education problems. And here were people coming into the adult learning center who had been through the 11th grade in a public school, and they couldn't read at a 3rd grade level. And boy, what that did for me, it put me in touch with my own privilege, with the great education I'd gotten in high school. By the time I was a senior in high school, I knew how to do public speaking. I knew how to read any book I put my hands on. I knew how to think logically. I knew how to articulate my position. And here people were coming in and they couldn't read and they couldn't write. And I didn't know I was privileged. You know, when we privileged, we like little fish swimming in an aquarium. We don't, all the fish swim around in the water. We don't even know it. I didn't know it, of what it meant to have a good education, a mother and a father who loved me, supported me, a father. He was an attorney. He taught me. He said, honey, you can be anything you want to be. And we traveled, and I was given all these opportunities. The thing about privilege is that you're given cushions and you're given resources and you don't even know you have them. You just take it for granted that everybody could have this. And here I am now up against people in St. Thomas struggling not only against poverty, but struggling against racism. I'm not too conscious of racism. You think, well, I'm not prejudiced against anybody. But racism is a system. It works in institutions. I'm watching how the police treat people. I'm watching how they treat the young males in St. Thomas. Not a fluke. Systematically, they've beaten the dickens out of them. The young black males. I'm noticing that it's a miracle if the young girls come into the adult learning center, they're not pregnant by the time they're 16 years old, 17. Well, they don't have college to look forward to. They don't have a senior trip in Disney World. They don't have a hope. They don't have a future. And the first young man that shows them attention, it's like they're extraordinary if they don't fall for it. And the next thing you know, here they're coming in and they got a baby. And it put me in touch with myself. And I said, Helen Prejean, take away all your cushions and your resources and your hope and your future. Can you say you wouldn't show up here at the age of 16 or 17 pregnant with a child? And I couldn't say that. So I'm just beginning to notice. I'm beginning to be awake. I'm noticing, for example, that when people in St. Thomas are killed, you're lucky if you can find it on page 15 of the newspaper, maybe 5 lines. And every single time a white person was killed in New Orleans, it was always on the front page of the newspaper. I begin to see how the media treats different people and different lives, and that some people seem to matter a whole lot. Other people don't seem to matter. And it's while I'm in this soil, it's while I'm in this environment, right around the corner from where I was working was a prison coalition office. And one day, coming out of the Adult Learning Center, my friend Chava Colin was coming out of the coalition office. We were like 2 little ants coming down St. Andrew Street. Bump, we meet. It was so casual. When I think of how casual it was. And he had a clipboard, because he had a project going on. He always had a project going on. And he sees me that day and he said, hey, Sister Helen, you want to be a pen pal of somebody on death row? I said, Sure. Sure. You study theology, you know, the qualities of God, the attributes of God, that God's all-knowing, God's compassionate, God's all-loving. I want to add one other attribute to God. God is sneaky. Because he says to me, you want to write? I say, sure. And he writes this guy's name down on this envelope. I do not know this is going to change my whole life. I don't know that that name on that envelope is going to write back to me. And that I am going to accompany him to the electric chair on the night of April the 5th, 1984, 2.5 years after our first write to him. I don't have a clue. All I know is I'm there to work with poor people. I don't even know anything about the death penalty yet, except this. I know this absolutely, without studying the issue at all. If he's sitting on death row in Louisiana, he's poor. And I'm there to work with poor people, so sure, I'll write him a few letters, I said. And he wrote down his name, Patrick Saunier, and his number, and his address, which gave me pause. Because his address was death row, and I had never written anybody who lived on Waiting to Die Street. I had never in my life done anything like that. So here I write to this man, and people were giving me these little warnings. Helen, you nuns are so naive. You think that man's interested in a spiritual relationship with you? He's just going to wait and try to get money out of you. And I was a little wary, I have to say. And in the first letter, I told him about his dignity as a person. I didn't believe the state of Louisiana should execute him. But I was a nun. I said I had no money. I must have said that 3 times. P.S. I'm a nun. I got no money. And you know the great irony? He never asked me for anything. If you saw the movie Dead Man Walking, the line, Matthew Poncelet is a composite character of Patrick Saunier and the other person I write about in the book Dead Man Walking of Robert Willie. Patrick Saunier was so glad love had found him, someone had found him. He never asked me for anything. An hour before he died, he's the one who said, "Thank you, ma'am, for loving me." And that line made its way into the movie in the character of Matthew Poncelet. But that came from him. I needn't have worried, but when you're first doing something you don't know, and people are very needy on death row, and they may ask people for money. Anyway, we began, and so I wrote and he wrote. And I remember his first letter, "Dear Sister Helen, I couldn't believe it when the guard stopped by my cell because I knew I wasn't writing anybody. And here out of the blue, I get a letter from you. I'd love to be your pen pal." And so we began. And I'd tell him about stuff going on at Hope House and what we were doing at the Adult Learning Center. And he'd tell me about life in a 6-foot by 8.5-foot cell where he's confined 23 out of 24 hours, back-to-back cells, no ventilation, stifling hot in the summer, reaching 98 or 100 degrees in the cell, and how sometimes he'd take the sheets off his bunk and wet them in the lavatory and put them on the cement floor to get a little coolness. See, one of the things that happens with the death penalty is that once you posit it's okay to kill a human being, to execute them, so it gets hot in the cells. In Oklahoma, they've built the death row cells underground. The men call them the tombs. And they're very close, and they have 2 men in there. And they never see green. They never see the outside. And even when they go out to exercise, there's a tall, tall wall. And they can look up and they can see the sky. Because once you posit, it's okay to kill people. So death row is, what did you think this was going to be, a Boy Scout camp? Or if you need health care. There have been a number of people who have died on death row. In fact, a man in the cell right next to Patrick Saunier who needed medical attention, and they didn't give it to him, and he died in his cell. Dobie Williams, who was just executed, had rheumatoid arthritis. You pray not to get sick in prison. He had rheumatoid arthritis, and it was such a battle for me, the lawyers, working with the warden, working with the people at the prison to try to get him medication. He would be frozen in pain on his bunk. He couldn't move. His hands were all gnarled. In fact, before he was brought to execution, the warden said, "Dobie, you want to go in a wheelchair, Dobie?" And Dobie goes, "No, I want to walk." Every man says that. I want to walk. And they say to me, pray God holds up my legs. It's that last bit of dignity that I will walk. And so it began that I wrote to this man and he wrote back, and then it all unfolded. You know, when God works in our lives, it's organic. It's not a lot of snapping and jerking. You ever notice? When people have these big dramatic things, suddenly I was zapped. It's hard to trust the zaps, because the zaps don't last. But organic unfolding of understanding and commitment growing, that we can trust. And that's what happened to me. So here I'm writing to this man, I realize he has nobody to come and see him. His mother would get physically sick when she'd go to the prison. She couldn't stand to go in the place that was going to kill her boy. And she'd been through a lot in her life. She had a lot of emotional problems. She'd been through a lot. She went to visit him one time. She came out, she got sick, and he understood that she couldn't come. He had nobody. We have 5,000 guys at maximum security in our prison at Angola in Louisiana. 2/3 of them have never gotten a postcard or visit from anyone. Prisons are places of great exile, places of great abandonment. All this time I've been meditating on the scriptures of Matthew 25. I was in prison and he came to me. But you know what I figured out? We all our own spin doctors when it comes to the scriptures. Because I would put my own little spin on it like, well, it doesn't apply to me. There are other people who do that. Or there are different ways of being in prison. Now, this doesn't literally mean that you got to be in prison. We entrap ourselves in our minds. We can be in prison in our mentalities. Here were the words. Now I'm looking at them and they're leaping off the page. I was in prison and you came to me. And I write to this man, Patrick Saunier, and I say, I will come and see you. He is so excited. He can't believe it. New Orleans is 2.5 hours away from Angola, the prison. And so he sends me the papers, and you got to fill them out. There's special categories for visitor, spouse, relative, friend. And this is the sneaky part of God, part 2. Because he says to me, I'm a Catholic, you're a nun. Would you be my spiritual advisor? And I say, sure. Fill out the form, spiritual advisor. This was 1982. And I don't dream that this man is going to be executed. Plus, I don't know. They're going to kill him in the electric chair at midnight, and at 5:45 in the evening, everybody has to leave the death house except the spiritual advisor. And I, as spiritual advisor, can walk with him, and then I will be able to say to him, Patrick, look at me, look at my face when they do this thing, and I will be the face of Christ for you. It's like God gives us a little bitty pin light, not a great big old searchlight. If God had given me a big old searchlight, God wouldn't have me on that team. I can tell you that. But here I am now, and I'm filling it out, and now I'm going to visit with him. I'm going into prison. All the years that prison was there, and I never saw it as my role to do that. I never saw it that was a call to me to go and visit people in prison. There is a tremendous need to do that, because prisons they're just such tough places to be. I was just in Ann Arbor, Michigan, University of Michigan. The students in Ann Arbor have gotten involved with prisoners nearby. They're doing tremendous things in the arts and in English and in poetry with prisoners. The students doing this. And so I drive to the prison. And so I walk into the place, and I know I am in foreign territory. New Orleans is a real Catholic place. Everybody and their cat is Catholic. And nuns are treated with a whole lot of respect. And here I am at this prison looking at this big old green sign that says, by stepping onto prison property, you subject yourself to this body search, body cavities, dog sniffing. I stopped reading the sign. I mean, my heart was going, you know, my fingertips were cold, and I'm thinking, boy, you can't play the nun card in this place. They don't care a hoot about who you are. It was like so foreign and strange and different, you know? And here the guards start bringing me through these gates, clang, clang. There are no soft sounds in prison. It's all bars and metal and cement. Woman on a tear, and they bringing me through, and I'm going, I'm in the belly of the beast. This is the belly of the beast. Where is this place? Because it seems like we kept going through gates and gates and gates. And of course, you never touch a doorknob when you're in prison. You never touch a doorknob. And imagine I was going to visit. Imagine your life when those bars clang behind you. A lot of times you hear people saying prisons being this place of these plush little places where they got weightlifting and color TV. To hear those gates clang behind you and to lose your freedom is a tremendous thing. It's a tremendous punishment. Just that, for starters. And we're not even talking about the rest of the situations in prison. And so then we rounded a corner, and there was a green metal door, and right above it, in red block letters, I saw the letters, Death Row. And I was there. And I remember just that I was at the place. And you know, driving up, I was behind this cattle truck where these cows were all jammed into this truck to be brought to be slaughtered. And then I looked at that sign, Death Row, and the enormity of it hit me. Everybody sitting in a cage in this place was waiting to be killed. And these are all human beings. And I was there. And then they locked me in a room, and then the guard says, I'll go get your man. And then I hear him coming. And I heard his voice for the first time, and it was Cajun. I could hear the French accent. I could hear him teasing the guard. And I'm nervous now, not just about the prison, I'm nervous about him. I'm thinking, I wrote him all these letters and all, but letters are one thing. We had 2 hours together, and I guess in the back of my mind, I've never in my life been in the company of somebody for 2 hours who's done something so terrible. Will I be able to talk to him normally? And the guards brought him in, hands handcuffed to a belt around his waist, leg irons on his legs, locked him into a cubicle. It was a heavy mesh screen, and I peered through it, and I was blown away by how human his face was. And he was smiling, and he had shaved and combed his hair, and he said, Sister Helen, you came. He was so glad I had come. And I didn't have to worry about what I was going to say to him in those 2 hours. Those 2 hours went by. He was talking. I was listening. You know, for 14 years now, I visited people in prison. And whenever you visit people in prison, you're in this very stripped down situation. It's just cement walls and the two of you. And I have gotten a precious gift over the years of doing that. And it is that maybe the best thing we ever give each other is the gift of our presence. Because all you got when you visit it is each other. Your conversation, your stories, your prayer. And maybe that's the deepest thing we all desire anyway, what children want from parents and spouses want, friends want. And I've learned how to hone that gift, to be present, being present. Like you now with me, you're all that exists tonight for me and us here together in this space and this time, sharing this together. So anyway, the 2 hours goes by. Next thing I know, the guard's saying, time's up, ma'am. I'm in the car driving back to New Orleans, and I think he didn't say what he did. He didn't tell me about the crime. And then I think, the first time I ever meet somebody, am I going to trust them enough to share with them the worst thing I've ever done in my life? And I figured it was going to be a journey. It was going to be a path. And that my job was to treat him with dignity, to accompany him, to be honest with him. But it wasn't my job to say, would you confess to me? That I would accompany him. And that is in fact what I did. So then I began to visit with him and found out his brother, Eddie, is serving 2 life sentences for the same crime. And that was my first question mark over the case. See, my father was an attorney. And I really thought that if people were sent to death row in the United States of America, maybe they didn't have a Johnny Cochran defense, but at least they had an adequate defense. I knew nothing about the legal system. And I presumed that his defense was adequate. And here was the first question mark. One brother got death and one brother got life. Obviously, it must have been for the same crime, but I didn't ask any questions. I didn't want to get into all this law stuff. I really didn't believe at this early stage that he would ever be executed because we hadn't executed anybody in such a long time. But then I start visiting with the brother. So then several months go by, and I go to the Prison Coalition office. I just didn't want to be naive. I'd never done anything like this before. And one day I just went in there. Now I've gotten to know Patrick Saunier somewhat. I've gotten to know his brother. I know enough to know that they're human beings and that they have dignity. And I know enough to know from their letters and from the visits that they are more than the worst thing they've ever done in their life. That human beings, all of us are more than the worst thing we've ever done in our life. That we are restorable, that we are redeemable, and we have this dignity to us. I mean, if there would be a way we could project up on a big screen here in this church tonight, each of us, and the worst thing we ever did in our life before everybody to see, and then to be told, that is all you are. And we would all be scrambling around saying, looking for the parts of ourselves like, I'll visit my grandmother. I've improved my study habits. Because we know that there's more to us. There's a transcendent quality and dignity in human beings. And I have known this now about Patrick Saunier, and I also know it about his brother. And so I go into the coalition office and I just say, could I have some background on the Saunier case? And they say, sure. And they pull out all these folders, put them on a table. And it was an October afternoon, I remember, because the sun was setting and there was this red slant of sun coming across that table. And they were leaving the office and they said, look, sister, when you come, you just pull the door. And I was alone. And I opened up the folder on the top of the heap and looked into the faces of two beautiful teenage kids. David LeBlanc, 17 years old, Loretta Bourque, 18 years old, and their big pictures are on the front page of the Daily Iberian, which is right in the middle of Acadiana in Louisiana. And it's November the 5th, 1977, and they're in their prom outfits, and they're smiling, and they're beautiful, and they're young, and they're dead. And the headline says, teenagers found murdered. And then the terrible details of the story leap out at me, because the details say how these two men that I was visiting, these two brothers were rabbit hunting that night near a sugarcane field, and the two kids came after a football game to park. And they came upon the kids in the car, and they had done this with other teenage couples. Nobody had been killed, but they had done the same thing, saying they were security guards and the kids were trespassing. But if the girl had sex with them, they wouldn't report them. But this night, it led to murder. And these two kids were found lying face down by this sugarcane field near St. Martinville. And there were bullet holes in the backs of their heads. Every parent's worst nightmare. And I read this, and now I know this. And I felt then and feel now what you must feel now. Outrage. Who doesn't feel outrage when we hear of these crimes? When good and decent, innocent life is taken in such a wanton, evil way. Outrage is legitimate. Outrage is what sensitive souls, morally sensitive people feel. Outrage is called for. And I felt it, and I still feel it. And right on the heels of that, I felt tremendous guilt. I'm visiting with these two people. I'm trying to show them dignity. I don't believe they should be executed. It was like I was consorting with the enemy. And then I think about the parents. Maybe I should go see the parents. And then I think, oh, how could I handle that? What if they say to me, sister, you care? You care about David? You care about Loretta? Louisiana allows us to go sit on that front row to watch him be executed. Can you be with us in that? Can you stand with us in that? And I'm thinking, how would I handle that? I'm clinging by my fingertips of to the principle that I believe, the bedrock, that the state should not imitate this violence. But I'm feeling the outrage and I'm feeling the pain of these people. You know that their lives could never be the same again. Everything gets shattered. Sometimes faith in God gets shattered. Later, when I did visit Lloyd LeBlanc's house, his son David, to see the Good Shepherd on the wall. Later, when I did become involved with the murder victims' families, to hear Shirley Carr, who lost 2 sons to murder within 6 months, say, I always took my kids to church. I brought up my kids to be good kids. I always prayed that God would protect my kids. What happens to faith in God when your child is killed? And I think about these parents, and I think about going to see them, and I'm a coward. I'm scared. I stay away. I don't go. It's the worst mistake I ever made in my life. And when I wrote the book, I had a good editor. He said, Helen, tell the truth. Don't just share with people the peaks of the waves when you do things right. Tell them when you make mistakes. That's part of your journey too. Well, this was a big mistake. I stayed away from them because I wasn't sure how to handle it and I was scared. And I don't meet the parents of the victims until the worst possible time. If you could design a scenario when you're going to meet the victims' families, the last act in Louisiana before somebody's executed is you have a pardon board hearing. And it's public and anybody can come. And you can't imagine a more polarized situation, because when you go into the pardon board, you sign the book which side you're on. You want the person to be executed or you don't. Thank God you don't have this in Maine. Thank God that you don't have this in Maine. And you're going to have to work to keep it that way, because people are going to run for political office, and it's such an attractive symbol for people to use to say they're going to be tough on crime. I hope by the time I finish telling you the stories and the facts, you're going to really know why you don't want to have it in Maine, okay? But anyway, this is when I meet the victim's family, was at this pardon board hearing. And the pardon board was behind closed doors voting. And here we're walking outside on the sidewalk, and the Bork family, whose daughter had been killed. And of course, they had just spoken before the pardon board, saying that they wanted to see the execution carried out. And it gets identified with their love for their loved one, because it's called justice for them. And it's, I mean, now I've known over the years victims' families that weren't for the death penalty, and sometimes they have people say to them, well, didn't you love your daughter? Because here society's offering you this penalty and you're not going for it. Didn't you love your kid? And of course they had just done that, and now we're walking outside, and the Bork family came up first. And they were so angry at me, they couldn't even talk to me. They like walked past, and right behind them are the LeBlanc family. That's Lloyd LeBlanc and his wife Eula. Their son David was killed. And they come right up to me. And I'm braced, because I think they're going to be just as angry as the Bork family. And Lloyd LeBlanc says, Sister Helen. He says, I'm Lloyd LeBlanc. This is my wife, Eula. It was our son, David, who was killed. He said, Sister, where have you been? We had nobody to talk to, and you can't believe the pressure on us with this death penalty thing. I said, oh, Mr. LeBlanc, I'm so sorry about your son. Don't think because I don't want Patrick Saunier to be executed that I don't care about your son. That should never have happened. He said, Sister, why didn't you come see us? I was so lame. I mean, I was so guilty. I just said, oh, Mr. LeBlanc, I'm so sorry. I didn't think you'd want to see me. And he says to me, and I got his words written on my forehead the rest of my life. He said, Sister, you don't know what I think till you come talk to me, find out what I think. And he took me by the hand, he was the first, and began to take me down the trail of tears that victim families walk. And I began to learn what they suffer. I began to go to murder victims' families' support group meetings. I began to hear the stories. I began to embrace their pain. Do you know what shocked me the most? In hearing their stories, it didn't shock me that a lot of them were really upset with the DA's office and the criminal justice system, because it's so hard to get justice. It's difficult for people. And the criminal justice system is not geared to help victims' families. It's geared to apprehend offenders, punish offenders. It becomes the state versus the offender, and the victim's really out of the loop. Civil law has as its aim to give restitution and to help victims, but not criminal law. So that part didn't shock me, that a lot of the stories were how the DA's office and when they weren't told when the court thing was. But what did shock me was how many people said after the funeral nobody came to see us. Or when I try to talk about my daughter, people change the subject because people didn't know how to deal with their pain, and so people stay away from people, and that they were alone and they were isolated. And I came out of one of those meetings one night, and that was how we started Survive. You know, when you get involved in this and you start seeing injustice and you start seeing suffering, you can't do everything. You know you can't do everything, but you can do one thing. And so I remember putting the car key into the lock, and I remember thinking, we got to start one of these groups in New Orleans. We need support groups all across this country for people who've been victims of violence. And maybe I can't start them all across the country, but I can do it in New Orleans. And so we had a Mennonite volunteer come, and we began Survive. And really it was in Survive with the mothers, African American indigent mothers, that I learned about race and the death penalty. That's when I really learned about race. I mean, if you look at who's on death row, the 3,500 people on death row in this country tonight, in the 38 states that have the death penalty, you'll see it's about 48% African Americans, 48% white, and then the other people of other ethnic groups. But where you really saw the race was who the victim was and who cared. And I found this out from the mamas in the group, 40 of them, all of them with their kids killed or their fathers killed or their mothers killed or their sisters killed. And the DA's office in New Orleans not only had not sought the death penalty for any of them, but hadn't even brought it to trial. And the women are saying, DA's office don't care about us. They didn't even expect to get justice. If you put the microscope down in this country, and I'm not just talking about the South, go look at Philadelphia, go look at Pennsylvania, go look at California, and see when the death penalty is sought and when it's not. Overwhelmingly in this country, it is sought when a white person is killed. When a person of color is killed, often there's a shrug of the shoulders and there's an acceptance of the death. We can't take race out of anything in this country. We especially can't take it out of the criminal justice system, because in the whole history of this country, it has always been considered the most serious crime of all to do a crime against a white person. When we had the death penalty for rape in this country, and 355 human beings were hung from ropes or killed in electric chairs for raping women, how many of the women who were raped do you think were women of color? It's always been color-coded. Race has always played a part in this country, and it still does. The 3,500 people selected for death in this country tonight, 85% of them are there because they kill white people. And every time they put a microscope down, when does the DA's office go for it? When do they not? It's always color-coded. Chattahoochee County in Georgia, white people killed 1 in 5 times go for the death penalty. People of color killed 1 in 19 times. And that's not just in Georgia. You can find the same thing in Pennsylvania. You can find the same thing anywhere. Alaska, they had somebody running for governor. He was making noises. He wanted to bring the death penalty into Alaska. I mean, Alaska's mostly got snow and ice and moose. They have very little crime. And he's going to introduce the death penalty into Alaska? And I was able to go up before that legislature, and I was able to hold out their track record to them. Look when you did practice it. Look how you practiced it. And it was all Native Americans who were selected for death. Always. For killing white people. And so one of the reasons why in Maine you don't want to do this thing, and you want to make sure you're vigilant that you don't do this thing, how are you going to ever draw up your list as to who is going to be worthy of the death penalty in this state? For killing whom? And when you go to make your list, that's when you start getting into trouble. What list? For policemen? Now understand me. No human being should be killed. The firm moral bedrock is all human life is precious. No human being deserves violence. But when you go to make the list, it's just so hard. Look in New Hampshire. They have the most restrictive of all the death penalties. It's if you kill a policeman. Then a child was killed in the state. And the governor tried to push the legislature to include it. Well, what about the death of children? And the legislature pushed it back. They didn't want to expand it. But that mother of that child would say to you, are you telling me you would have the death penalty for a policeman, but my child was killed and you're not going to have the death penalty for my child? And then when you're going to go to define it, how do you define child? Most states, when they have that in their code, their death penalty code, it means 12 or younger. And so the mother of a 13-year-old says to you, are you telling me because my child was 13 and was killed is not worthy of the death penalty because he was not 12 years old? I lost my universe when I lost my child. How are we going to make the list? We can never make the list. Even the policeman, the woman who comes and says, my husband was a firefighter. He was going up a ladder to save a person in a burning building. He was risking his life, and a sniper killed him. You telling me you don't have the death penalty for my husband because he's a firefighter and not a policeman? And you just try to make the list. And Maine isn't going to be able to do it any better than any other state. The best is just to keep it out. Don't get into it. Don't allow yourself to get into it. Yes, heinous crimes are going to happen. People are going to be outraged. But if you got that firm moral bedrock, even when you want to go for the death penalty and the rage is so strong in the community, it protects you from doing it. And so I get involved with murder victims' families, and I begin to go down the road with them, and I begin to find more about this man, Lloyd LeBlanc. Go pray with him in this little chapel. He's the hero of Dead Man Walking. He's one of the most courageous people I ever met. When the deputies brought him out to identify David's body in the morgue, and they pulled his son out on that tray, the cold body of his son, his only son, as he told me, he said he was our only boy, our only son. Eula and I are too old to have another one. When they killed him, they snipped the branch off our family tree. There'll never be another LeBlanc. And when the deputies brought him in there to identify his boy, he said the prayer. It rose to his lips that he had learned as a child and that he had tried to live out his whole life. Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. And when he got to the words in the Our Father, and forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us, he said the words. He told me later, I didn't feel the words, but I knew the road Jesus wanted me to go down. And I also knew if I didn't deal with the bitterness and hatred in my heart, it was going to eat me alive, and I had to be there for my wife, Eula. I have to be there for my daughter, Vicky. I got to be there for my grandchildren, that I'd be dead inside too, and I couldn't let that happen. And so I prayed for the grace of forgiveness, and he started walking down the road, and God's grace met him on that road, and he forgave the people. He visited with Pat and Eddie Saulnier's mama, Gladys Saulnier, and he brought her a basket of fruit. And he said to her, Miss Saulnier, none of us really ever knows what our children might do, and I don't hold you responsible for what your boys did and for the death of my son. I also have met victims' families down the road over these years. And then the second story I tell in Dead Man Walking, Robert Willie was the second person I accompanied to execution. A much tougher man. The character of Matthew Poncelet in the film Dead Man Walking is a composite, and the tough part all comes from Robert Willie. Swastika on his arm, joined the Aryan supremacy group at the Marion, the federal penitentiary. Been an outlaw from the time he was a little kid. Run away, did drugs, tough guy. Only knew him 2 months. And he and another man, Joseph Vacara, had brutally killed a young girl. Faith Hathaway brutally killed her. And of course, their parents, her biological mother Elizabeth, her stepfather Vernon, they had their own press conference before his execution and said, we can't wait to see him die. And who doesn't understand that? Their pain and their loss, and here Louisiana's going to allow them to sit on the front row. And they had their own press conference. They let everybody know, let it come. We've been waiting for this moment. And so the night of the execution, and I'm there because I'm there with Robert, I'm his spiritual advisor. The thing I'll always remember was afterwards, when we came out, they bring you in prison vehicles to the front of the prison, you come through the gate into the parking lot, all the media was there. And of course they all rushed up to the Harveys because these people had gotten national, attention by this desire for vengeance and to watch this man die. And so then they all went up to him and all the lights were on him and they said, well, Mr. and Mrs. Harvey, you watched Robert Willie die tonight in the electric chair. How do you feel now? And I was looking at him across this parking lot, and Vernon Harvey got in front of the cameras and he said, anybody got any whiskey? Anybody want to dance? We got the SOB tonight. Every victim's family ought to have the chance I had tonight. And then he added, but you know what? The SOB died too quick. I hope he burns in hell. And I got to know these people. Whenever I would visit with him, Vernon Harvey would kill Robert Willie again. He couldn't kill him enough. And looking at him that night and hearing him, I knew if there had been a way that they could have killed Robert every night and he could witness it, that chair at the dining room table where Faith sat was still going to be empty, because human life, each of us is unique and irreplaceable. And that he had hoped to assuage his great pain, and he had watched this death, and he and his wife couldn't stay away from the executions. Every time there was an execution in Louisiana, they'd bring their aluminum folding chairs and their little signs that said, another murderer getting his due, justice for victims. They couldn't break out of it. Partly, I think, they were so much in the public eye that if they had ever stopped doing it, it would maybe look like they were betraying faith. And there is a pressure on families, a kind of social pressure. Well, what, you're not doing your vigil in front of the prison anymore? Don't you care about your daughter? You used to do those vigils, didn't you? And I think they got caught in it and they couldn't break out. I can't say, from my experience, that even when victims' families can watch people die and be put to death, that it can heal their hearts. I know it may give them some satisfaction, and I've heard the statements that people have made. Carla Faye Tucker's husband, not Carla Faye, the husband of the woman who was killed by Carla Faye Tucker, he made these statements on Larry King Live of, man, what satisfaction to see her die. But it's like to watch another death. How can that heal the human heart when a human life has been taken? And the other thing about the death penalty is when you hear people say we got to do it for justice for victims' families, first of all, realize we're talking about a very, very selective process. Most victims' families are never going to get this chance. You know there are 18,000 homicides in this country every year, and you know that 1% of people are chosen for the death penalty. Only 1%. That's a lot of victims' families. And then the other thing is, what can bring closure? What can bring healing? The victims' families I have known over the years who have healed are those that have community around them, who have family around them, who have church, who have faith. They heal. In time, they heal. But as one of the men said, one of the victims in Oklahoma City, we had a gathering of some of the victims' families in Oklahoma City. Catholic Charities called them together when I visited. And I will always remember this man in the middle of the discussion that we were having, whose daughter had been killed in the Oklahoma City bombing. At one point he said, let's not use that word closure anymore. He said, we can cope with God's grace. We can cope, but closure, every day of my life I'll think of my daughter. And so I get involved with the murder victims' families and begin to experience their pain. And it put in me a tremendous, well, I guess the only way to describe it is like in the Gulf of Mexico, when the deep water meets the shallow water, there's a thing called a riptide, like a riptide in my soul, because I was going back and forth over to both sides. And the other thing I knew, though, was that when people were executed, there was another victim's family that nobody saw, an unseen victim's family. Like when Dobie was killed, here's that little family standing around his grave to bury him. The state of Louisiana had killed their son, but he was just as dead. If somebody had come up on the street with a gun, he was killed by violence. Plus, this little family has the shame and humiliation of having their loved one executed by the state. And they have all that to bear besides. It's a road we don't need to go down. All we do is multiply victims' families and sorrow and tragedy. And it doesn't heal anything. And it doesn't prove anything. And it doesn't deter anything. Because the 38 states that have the death penalty have roughly double the homicide rate of states that don't. And in Louisiana, in the summer of '87, after the McCluskey decision, we executed 8 people in 8.5 weeks. And the murder rate in New Orleans went up 16.3%. And the main reason is the people doing the thinking and the people doing the murdering are 2 separate sets of people. It's not like people sit at the kitchen table in the morning and decide if they're going to go kill somebody. Violence comes out of lives of chaos and laced with alcohol and drugs and not thinking of consequences. And so people aren't thinking of consequences. You could boil them in oil in the public square. And is that going to deter crime? The police chiefs know that. The mayors of this city know that, of this country. When asked, what are ways to deter crime in your community? Community policing, drug prevention, drug rehabilitation, working with at-risk kids, working in the public schools, recreation programs, the death penalty. They all put the death penalty last because it doesn't have anything to do with deterrence. And anybody who knows this issue knows that. And so I'm with Patrick Saunier when they execute him. And I take you with me through this in this book, because in my life I had never been involved in anything like this. The death house, he was brought over to the death house, and there's one other part of this story. And it's the people who got to do the killing. If you bring the death penalty into Maine, none of you are going to do the killing. And it's not going to be the legislature that's going to do the killing or the governor. You're going to have to hire some people who are going to do your killing for you. And I start meeting these people. And I tell their stories too in Dead Man Walking. The guards, the strap-down team, the warden, they all involved in the killing of a human being. And they put the best face they can on it. They say, well, it's the law. Well, it's the jury. It's been through the courts. They know it's legal. And here I have Major Felton Cootie calling me in his office after he had been through 5 executions. He was on the strap-down team. And he didn't even strap him in the chair. His job was just to take a paper sack after they were executed and go in their cell and get their soap and their toothbrush and their personal belongings to give to their family afterwards. And he called me in there and he said, Sister, I'm going to have to quit this job. He said, I've been through 5 of these executions, and I come home afterwards and I get in my easy boy chair and I can't sleep and I can't eat, because in my guts I know I'm helping to kill a defenseless man, and I can't do it anymore. And he did quit. He quit his job in Angola, and I tell his story in Dead Man Walking. There's a protocol. You got to do this thing. They write it up in a book. Day 1, you do this. Day 2, you do this. First, you move the one on death row who's the next one to be executed, like Dobie, down to cell 1. Because the guard's going to come every 15 minutes and start putting in a log how the prisoner's bearing up. Does it look like he might try to commit suicide? They don't want anybody committing suicide. Does it look like he might try to escape, do something desperate? And so they start writing in the log. And you're now in cell 1, And then they take you out and weigh you and measure you because they're going to get a guard of your size and your build, and they're going to practice for this execution. They're going to practice when you go peacefully, and they're going to practice when you resist. And then they move you over to the death house. Dobie was brought to the death house 3 times. He was executed on January 8th, but he was brought into the death house on June the 12th and on November the 18th, and he got within an hour and a half of death, and he got a stay of execution, and they brought him back to his cell, and then he did it all over again, and his family with him. Each time his family leaving him at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, kissing him goodbye, thinking it was the last time they'd see him alive. His mama praying that they wouldn't kill her son, and then coming back and coming back. And one of the reasons internationally why the death penalty is being abolished in countries around the world is because it involves the element of torture, and everybody knows it. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, written large on the wall of the UN Commission of Human Rights in Geneva, where I attended last March. Articles 3 and 5, basic human rights, that human beings have a right to life, which means they shall not be killed, and Article 3, that human beings shall not be subjected to cruel and degrading punishment. Cruel and degrading punishment, torture. Who can say to me, to anyone, that it is not torture to take a conscious human being, put him in a cell, and then say we're going to take you out and kill you on a certain night? No, maybe not tonight. Go back to your cell, maybe in a month, maybe in 6 weeks, maybe in 5 years. That is the practice of torture. And it always will involve torture, no matter what method we have at the end. And now most states go to lethal injection. And it's so clean that they even put alcohol on your arm before they lethally inject you. That's how antiseptic death is. You get a germ-free death. But the torture's in there because you can't take consciousness out of human beings. And the 5 people I've accompanied to execution always say at the end, I am so tired. Because when you go in the death house, you really are going in to die or to live. And you walk that fine to be prepared for both. Just picture it. Picture anybody in your family going through this. And so, Patrick was brought to the death house 3 days ahead. He didn't want his mother. He didn't want anybody coming. I was it. I was everything. I was mother. I was sister. I was spiritual advisor. I was friend. And I'd known him for 2.5 years. I kept hoping, because I'd never in my life experienced anything like this, that something was going to happen that was going to save his life. I couldn't believe they really were going to kill him. And when you go into the death house, the tiles are all polished, and the coffee pot's percolating, and the secretary is typing the forms for the witnesses, and it feels like and there's a Coke machine there where you can get snacks, and it looks like life. I kept feeling like I was in a hospital, and they're following a protocol. 3 days away, 2 days away, 1 day away, and then it's the day. It's the day of his death. And I'm driving to the prison, and the azaleas are blooming in Louisiana, and the dogwood, and the new green on the trees. And I remember thinking, this is too beautiful a day to kill anybody. They can't kill Patrick. They can't. And then the hours tick off. And then it's 6 o'clock, and he served his last meal. And then it's 10 o'clock, and the guards come in to prepare his body for execution. And they shave his hair, and they shave his eyebrows, and they cut the left pants leg of his blue jeans, and they shave around the calf of his leg where the electrode is going to go, and they put a clean white t-shirt on him. And he comes to the other side of this metal door where we were visiting. And he was prepared. He was truly sorry for what he had done. Of all the people I have known, he had the greatest capacity for remorse and sorrow, what happened with the 2 kids. The truth is, his brother Eddie killed the kids. But he knew Eddie was emotionally very volatile, and he was guilty. He was guilty of what they did with the teenage kids. He never claimed innocence. He knew he wasn't innocent. In truth, he was innocent of first-degree murder. And that was when I find out what kind of lawyer he had, that his lawyer visited with him for 2 half-hour periods to prepare his case. One was a half hour the morning of the trial. That his jury was selected in a day. By Thursday night, they found him guilty. By Friday, they sentenced him to death. It was a wash. And by the time a volunteer lawyer came in there for his appeals, and he didn't know what he was doing either, he lost his life. He lost his life in the courts because he didn't have a good defense. And I learned for the first time, doctors make a difference. You need a good brain surgeon. You need a good brain surgeon. But lawyers make a difference. In life and death in this country, lawyers make a difference. And people on death row do not have lawyers. For their appeals, they don't have lawyers. They cut out all the federal defense centers. And so they're moving toward their death without lawyers. And that's the main reason why only poor people go to death row. You ever heard the saying, capital punishment means them without the capital get the punishment? And it's not that poor people don't do terrible crimes sometimes, they do. But rich people do terrible crimes, but you're never gonna find them on death row because they're gonna get the Johnny Cochrans of the world, and the DA's gonna think 14 times before they go into trial against a Johnny Cochran battery of defense and maybe lose. They don't wanna lose. They're much more prone to plea bargain in those cases. And here's this man, Patrick Saunier. And we had a communion service, and he was Catholic, and he had gone to confession. He had prepared himself to die. And he said to me, Sister Helen, look, you just pray for me, but you can't be there at the end, he said, because it's going to be terrible, he said. And I don't want to see you scarred. You could be psychologically scarred by watching this. And it was the electric chair. And it's 1900 volts. And then they let the body cool, and 500 volts, then 1900 volts. The body's very badly burned. They protect the witnesses with a plexiglass thing, but it's, you see it. You know what's happening. And he's saying to me, and I know he's trying to protect me. He said, look, thank you. You just pray for me and just pray God holds up my legs. And I said to him, Patrick, there is no way you were going to die alone. I mean, I had a strength in me. You know, after Patrick was executed, I read about an execution. I had to sit down. My knees got weak. But when I was with him, I was strong. I said, Patrick, you look at me. You look at my face. Christ does not want us doing this, Patrick. I will be there for you. And I was. And when they brought him out, he said to the warden, Warden, can I ask you one question? Can Sister Helen touch my arm? And I had never touched him. We always had visited behind these screens. And I put my hand up on his shoulder, realized how tall he was, and read to him from Isaiah 43. If he could hear the words, I wanted him to hear words from the scripture about God's love for him and his dignity. I have called you by your name and you are mine. And if you pass through the fire, you'll not be burned. Or through the sea, you will not drown. And then we were there. I looked up and there was the execution chamber. And there was a fluorescent light and it was gleaming on this oak chair and the straps are ready. The guards are all around him. And the guards were taking me by my 2 arms because I'd followed him into the execution chamber to lead me over to the witnesses. And I leaned over and I kissed him on the back. And I remember the words of Jesus. And the last will be first. And sinners and prostitutes are getting into the kingdom of heaven ahead of you. For some reason, those words were in my mind. I kissed him on the back. And I said, Patrick, pray for me. I wanted him to remember me to God. And he turned around like this and he said, Sister Helen, I will. And then he said his last words and he asked for forgiveness. But he said real clearly, and this Lloyd LeBlanc had to deal with for the rest of his life, but Eddie done it, he said. And he walked over to the chair and they worked very quickly. The guards had practiced for this moment, strapped him in, but he saw me, he saw my face. The last act that they do is to put a mask over his face to protect the witnesses from seeing when all those volts would hit his body. But he saw my face and he looked at me. And that was the last moment of his life.
and I was there for him. And then they killed him. And I walked out of that execution chamber. Now that was April the 5th, 1984. And it was inside me as clear as it could be. If the people of this country could really see what we're doing, they'll reject the death penalty. And I'm the witness, and my job is to go out and to tell the story. I didn't know then I'd write a book. I didn't know there'd be a movie. I didn't know the San Francisco Opera was going to do an opera. I didn't know Tim Robbins was going to write a play. All I knew was whoever would listen to me, I would tell this story, and I would educate people about the death penalty. It's such a selective thing anyway, 1% out of 18,000. It won't even cause a ripple in the criminal justice system if we abolish it tomorrow morning. And the other thing you need to know is we have an alternative. One of the things that fuels the death penalty, other than the outrage over the crimes, is that people say, if we don't execute them, they're going to get out of prison in a few years and they're going to kill again. The only way we can be safe is to execute them. You need to know that over the last 10 years, state legislatures all across this country have tightened up sentencing for first degree of felony murder. And people who are sentenced for those murders do not get out of prison in a few short years. They either get real life without parole or mandatory long term before they can be considered for parole. We can be safe without imitating the very violence that we're trying to teach our children we can't do. We're the only Western industrialized country in the world executing our citizens. 185 member nations of the United Nations, 109 now abolishing or doing a moratorium on the death penalty, including the countries of the former Soviet Union. Russia, in their, whatever the name of their parliament is, what do they call it, abolished it a month ago. The countries of the former Soviet Union want to belong to the European Union. Their future's in Europe. And they are putting moratoriums on the death penalty and abolishing it. Only the United States sticks out. And we are the ones who have to change that. We change it by becoming aware that we're abusing human rights, that we're torturing people, and that we got an alternative. And that's what the Pope said. When the Pope visited St. Louis, the Catholic Church has developed its teaching on the death penalty because of the experience of people and the advance in human rights in the world. I mean, the Catholic Church has a long, long history of supporting the death penalty, as many Christian churches do. Judaism put protections around the death penalty, so many of them, that in fact you can't practice it. You got to have 2 eyewitnesses, positive eyewitnesses, and you got to be willing to throw the first stone. They put so many protections around it, nobody could do it. But Christian church has a long, long history of upholding the death penalty. Catholic Church among them. But that's changed now. As of September the 8th, 1997, the church changed its teaching because, as it says in the Catholic Catechism and most Christian denominations, we have an alternative. We have prisons. We can incarcerate people. We don't have to kill them. I invite you to think these thoughts, to reflect on this. I invite you to read. I appreciate that most of the people I meet, good and decent people like yourselves, have deep ambivalent feelings about the death penalty. I appreciate that. But you don't have to stay with the ambivalence. You can sort it out and you can come out on one side or the other. And you do that by getting information and by bringing your own heart there. And here's the last little moral question I'm going to leave you with before we begin our discussion together. If you're for the death penalty, and you believe people who do these terrible crimes deserve to die for what they do, then you got to ask yourself a question. Are you willing to kill them? Are you willing to pull the switch? Are you willing to plunge the needle? Because if you're not, and you got to have somebody else do it for you, that means there's a part of your heart that hasn't said yes to this thing. And that's worth exploring about where you really are on the issue. Okay, I'm going to stop. We got microphones out there, and let's talk together.
Thank you. Thank you. All right, let's have some discussion here. That sounded like a great rainstorm. Middle microphone.
First thing I want to do is thank you for not, in the movie, for leaving us with no answers. I mean, with no, black and white, having to really think. That was really, I really appreciate that. As a Unitarian Universalist minister, I've been in prisons to visit people. And what comes to me, of course, we are against the death penalty. Our denomination is a long history of being against it. But what comes to me from my visits is it's also torture to incarcerate people for the rest of their lives. I mean, I really wrestle with that and whether there should be some choice for people who receive life imprisonment about
Yeah, I mean, prisons. I mean, we got 1.8 million people in prison, and we're throwing people in prison for longer and longer and longer sentences. 60% of people in prison are there for nonviolent crimes, and it's the mandatory drug sentences that are putting people in prison forever. Half of our 5,000 guys at our prison in Louisiana are there for the rest of their lives. And if you're 18 and you push heroin one time with no prior felony, you have a mandatory life sentence. And politicians get points. Every time the legislatures meet, they up the ante for punishing criminals. And we have a terrible situation on our hands. California, the budget of California, 4 years ago, they had always put more in education than prisons. It reversed. Now more goes into prisons and they're cutting the budget for higher education. And what we're not doing in social programs of working with people to get out of poverty and working with public schools and working with at-risk kids, we're putting into prisons at $20,000 a year. That's the most intensive welfare program you can imagine. And we're in a negative spiral with this. And we need a lot of work. We need prison reform. We need alternatives to prison. We need drug courts. We need a lot. And the only way that it's going to happen is when people begin to be in the community, begin to be involved. That's the way it's going to change. Yes.
Sister Anna, thank you very much and welcome you to the state of Maine.
Thank you.
For coming here. You cleared up, I appreciate your clearing up the confusion that if you care for and treat as a human being the offender in a crime, that means you do not care for the families of victims.
Yeah.
My name is Ben, I work at the Abused Women's Advocacy Project, the Battered Women's Program here in town.
Right.
And we as a group of men in the Lewiston, Auburn area have committed to holding a vigil anytime a woman or child is killed in the state of Maine. And actually the next vigil is here at Bates College, not next Monday, but the Monday after, and I'll hand you green flyers if you could all come. And I don't have a question, I just wanted to thank you, and it's too bad you're not going to be here because I'd invite you to come to the vigil.
Well, if I were here, I would come. I like the people of Maine. I like Maine even when it rains. You have a fresh spirit here. I don't know, what is it, huh? Good for you. That's great that you work with that. Maybe, are you, oh, I didn't see that microphone, I'm sorry.
I'm just wondering if you think the people that you work with People on death row in general, but specifically the people that you worked with, if you think that such a profound and complete redemption would have been possible had it not been in the face of such imminent premature death.
If, in other words, if they hadn't been put to death, if they would have undergone...
If they knew they were going to live the rest of their life in jail or out of jail.
Would they have lived in jail?
Do you think that they would have been able to achieve such a complete redemption?
Ah, good question. See, because actually this is really interesting. At the Berlin Film Festival, I went with Tim Robbins for it because Dead Man Walking was being featured. I guess Susan trusted him to go with a nun, so I went over with him to Berlin. And they had press from all over the world. I had never in my life experienced anything. Tim said, we're going to do some interviews. I go, okay. I did 60 interviews from Brazil and Japan. It was amazing. And then they had journalists from all over the world. And during the press conference, somebody got up and asked your question. One of the journalists said, Mr. Robbins, you know, here's this man, Matthew Postle. He did this terrible crime. He gets the death penalty. And he comes to responsibility. I mean, he achieves redemption. If he hadn't gotten the death penalty, if he had had a life sentence, chances are he never would have come to this. So therefore, death penalty's good for people. Helps them achieve salvation. So I looked over at Tim. I couldn't wait to see what he was going to do to answer that question. And Tim said to him first, you really can't say that if a person has a life sentence, that he won't change his life. We can't say that about each other, that only death can make people change. And then the other thing Tim said is, if you believe in a God who can only bring people to salvation by torturing them and by the fear of death, I don't believe in that kind of God. And then he said, what made Matthew Poncelet change? Death or the fact that for the first time in his life he met unconditional love? And I want to say my experience of dealing with people on death row, it is not the threat of state-imposed death that makes people's hearts change. In fact, it can make people more defensive. Like Robert Willie, if you get Dead Man Walking and you read his story, the tough guy, he said, hell, sister, they trying to kill me. And all of self-preservation kicked in. In order to feel remorse or pain, you have to leave yourself, enter into the pain of another that you have caused, and say, I'm sorry. But if you're wrapped and caught in yourself, you don't have the power, the capacity to do that, to feel that remorse. The death penalty in and of itself doesn't help people feel remorse or be transformed. Love can help them be transformed, but not having the threat of death. That doesn't cause personal transformation. And I have found, like Robert Willie, I only had 2 months with him, and his whole life had been a life of being this tough little guy, never showing his feelings, never feeling tenderness in his own life, and he was very limited in his capacity of what he could feel for the victims. One time he said, when we were talking, he said, well, I hope my death gives them some peace. And when he said that, I said, Robert, that's a loving thing to say to them. And I went on that like gravy on rice when he said that. I mean, I really supported him in that. And then those were his final words that he chose at the end. Because he could have said anything at the end. I didn't know what he was going to say because he was so limited in his capacity to feel for other people. Even though he had done this terrible thing, he was terribly insensitive to what people were suffering because of what he had done. Yeah.
Sister, I want to thank you for coming and expressing and showing to be valid the same views that work in the prison ministry known as Kairos, where we have brought that into the state of Maine, and we have, in answer to the girl's previous question, is it the person who is only facing death who's going to have that type of a transformation, that type of a redemption of self? And we have found in Maine here, in the 3 times that we have so far held our Kairos weekends, that the individuals that are there, that are on life sentences, some have already served 20 and 30 years of those life sentences, do come and have the ability to make a transformation, have a personal redemption. And it seems that the key is what you have already expressed, that we use as the 4 L's. Listen, listen, love, love.
Listen, I want to put a plug in here for Kairos. Kairos is a wonderful program of retreats for people in prison. Do you have a way people can sign up for Kairos retreats to help you? Okay, so in the back there, and you go into the prison for the weekend, and you're with the men or you're with the women, and you have a retreat with them, and it's such an experience because they're human beings, and anybody who comes in with love and care and listening, they're like little plants. It's like when the sun and the rain hits, they grow, like all of us respond, and it's a wonderful program. Thank you for doing that. And keep on doing that. And I hope you get some people to help you tonight. Okay, we'll have these 2 people, and then I want to head out to those books because anybody who wants to get one, I want to be able to sign them. Yeah, thank you. She's pointing me up here to the table. Okay, you and then you.
I'd like to think for a minute if you can help us about hate crimes, because you brought up the subject tonight of racism in our country. And you brought very much to our minds those cases in which black men are sent to death row for killing white men. But we haven't talked about those murders in our country where white men are killing black men, dragging them to pieces behind pickup trucks. So I'd like us to think for a minute about those crimes. And in doing so, bear in mind that it's not been that long ago that our history witnessed organized murder of 6 million Jews in Europe, never mind all the gypsies and homosexuals who died in death camps too. And for 50 years we have hunted down Nazis and killed them and called it justice. And how do we take that experience and apply it to the question of hate crimes in our country?
First, I want to say any crime against another human being where they're treated as an object is hate. Okay? Executions are hate. It's distilled hatred. Okay? The hate crime of this John King that dragged James Byrd behind that truck and dismembered him caught all of our attention because it was so horrible. And so they gave the death penalty to John King, and it was the first time since 1840 since a white man had ever gotten a death penalty for killing a black man in Texas. It stood out. It was so public. It was so heinous. It was so terrible. And what was that jury to do? When they had the death penalty, what were they to do? If they had handed down anything less than a death sentence, they would have felt that they were disrespecting that family who had lost James Byrd. They were under tremendous pressure to hand out death. That's one of the reasons why we have to take death away from us as an option. Because those juries, like the jury for Timothy McVeigh, what are they going to do? If they handed down anything less than death to Timothy McVeigh, the 168 victims standing there, what are they going to say to them? There's tremendous pressure. We have hate crimes. We have hate crimes against gay and lesbian people. I just wrote a note to Matthew Shepard's parents. That's the young boy tied to the fence post who was killed, the young gay guy. Then in Alabama, there was another. There's a lot of violence against gay and lesbian people. And you can't have attitudes in your mind. You can't have homophobia and not be surprised that it's going to turn out in violence and action. And it is. It's a tremendous, I don't know the statistics, but I know they're terrible for hate crimes against gay and lesbian people. So what road do we have to go down? We got to go down the road, and we got to work with the children, and we got to work with each other that human beings deserve dignity and respect, and that no one deserves violence. Some crimes are going to stand out because they're so terribly heinous, and they're going to stand out. But there are many of them that happen every day. It doesn't come to anybody's attention, and the people killed and the people maimed are just as real, and it's just as much an act of hate as the ones that get the very public attention. So I guess I'm saying we got to think of all crime as crimes of hate. Okay, and we have to go down the road that we are not going to imitate the violence in the punishment that we choose for people, because in fact when we do that, we become them. When we kill John King, whoever will be the people to kill him, it will be done in a very premeditated way. They won't drag him behind a truck and they won't dismember him, but they're going to be involved in the act of killing him. And when you move yourself down to that level, in a way, then you become him in his act. And as a society, we have to lift ourselves above that, because then we're engaged in legalized hate. Because I don't care how you try to shake it. It's really hard to convince somebody you're loving them when you take them into a chamber and kill them. That's an act of distilled hatred. And that too then becomes an act of hate. And so we've got to, you know, all the great religions of the world teach us that the road to our salvation is the road of compassion and the road of love. And that love is stronger than hate. But we have to build that love. And it's based on the dignity of the person. Even the dignity of the person who has done a terrible crime. Can we uphold their dignity as well?